Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third event in the Champinafu webinar series. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski, and I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. I would like to just take a moment to orient you to the platform we're using tonight, which is called GoToWebinar. You should be able to see a control panel with a few options. If you don't happen to see this panel, you can expand it by clicking on the orange button with the right pointing arrow, the white right pointing arrow. You also click this button to hide the control panel if you ever want it out of your way. If at any point during this presentation you want to ask myself or the presenters a question, just click on the small arrow next to where it says questions to expand the questions box and type your question in. Click send or hit the enter key to get it to us. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the event, and we're going to have time towards the end of the presentation to answer all of those. All right, let me get you closer to the main event. I'm going to introduce Dave, who's also going to be introducing our panelists. Dave Eckert is the program chair for the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club. The Mary's Peak Group is responsible for coordinating this series, including bringing many local organizations together to make it possible. The library is very grateful to Dave and the Mary's Peak Group for bringing this amazing series to the community, and we're very proud to be a part of it. Dave is going to tell us a little more about this series, about our additional co-sponsors, and about our panelists. Dave, would you like to join us on screen?
And wait a minute, all of a sudden, start broadcast. Okay. Am I on screen yet?
I'm not seeing you. Let me send you a webcam request.
Okay, share my web screen. There we go. And how about now?
All right, we got you.
Okay.
Good to see you, Dave.
Better than last time, right? Okay. Thank you and welcome everybody. My name is Dave Eckert. I'm the program chair for the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club. We are honored to help present this tonight. And we live in the area known as Champinafu, and it's the homeland of the Ampanafu Kalapuya. And this obviously is dedicated to the Ampanafu Kalapuya. And we acknowledge that most of us who are presenting are settlers here, and this is not our original homeland. So let's move, and you can see the area here. It goes from the around the Willamette River. It's really based on the Marys River and goes up toward Mary's Peak and includes the eastern portion of Mary's Peak. And you can just see the outlined general area there. Let's see if my slides go forward. This is our fifth annual Champinafu series. The first one was in October on fire since time immemorial, an indigenous fire chronology for Western Oregon. And now you can see that on YouTube. If you'd like to see it on YouTube, just go on YouTube and search fire since time immemorial, and that will come right up and you can watch the whole thing. And then our second one, let's see, I'm having trouble getting this forward here. Okay, was in November, Trees of Mary's Peak, the stories they tell, and that is also, you can watch on YouTube the same way. Go to YouTube and then search for Trees of Mary's Peak and it will come up and you can watch that anytime you want. And then tonight, of course, is Oregon's Water, What Coyote Can Teach Us. And we'd like to express our gratitude to the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde for coming up with this presentation, the title and the subject, and for providing the speakers. And we'll be managing the show as soon as I finish my introductions. And so thank you. I'd like to show appreciation for the Mary's Peak Group of the Sierra Club that initiated this program in consultation and collaboration with the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Run. And like I said, it's our 5th year. It's been a lot of fun. We started showing it at the Majestic Theater pre-COVID, and then went on a webinar and format for the foreseeable future. Another co-sponsor of this, the Spring Creek Project, which has been a funding co-sponsor since the first one we had. And the Spring Creek Project is running a program coming up in January through March, which is following on to our first presentation about fire. And it's a series of lectures that are about called Lookout: Envisioning Futures with Wildfire. And you can go on their website that's shown below and sign up for it. They're free, and they're every Tuesday at 6 or I don't know if it's every Tuesday, but on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. from January 4th to March 15th. And again, thanks to the Spring Creek Project. Corvallis Sustainability Coalition is a new sponsor this year in the particularly Community Inclusion Action Team. And this came as a result of legacy donation from Francis Stillwell, who's been a donor toward this program since the beginning. Thank you, Francis, and thank you to the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition. And then this is the first year that the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library has been a co-sponsor for this particular series, and the library now hosts it on their web platform, and they do all the work of recording it, and then they do the closed captioning afterwards, and they record it and put it on YouTube about a month after the program. If you registered for this program, you will get a recording of it that's in its pre-closed caption format. And even if you didn't watch it, those who registered will get that probably within a few days. Most of our speakers this time have been staff from the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. And the sponsors agreed that to honor these speakers, we're giving a donation to the Chichalu Museum in the Grand Ronde. If you have never been there, once the COVID restrictions lift, I strongly recommend you do go to the Chichalu Museum up on the Grand Ronde Reservation. It is a very special museum, and everyone who lives in this area should be visiting that, and we're honored to be able to donate to it. So for tonight, Oregon's water, what Coyote can teach us. Our first presenter will be David Harrelson. Some of you may remember David. David gave this very first presentation for the Champinefu Lecture Series 5 years ago, and he was one of the speakers for the first one this year. David is the Cultural Resources Manager for the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. He is also a tribal member, an Ampenefu Kalapuya tribal member, mind you. He has an ancestor who is a headman for the Ampenefu Champinefu. And he has been a strong supporter, the strong supporter of this program. He graduated from Lewis and Clark in history, and he has worked in cultural resources for 10 years. He has a lot of special interests, serves on a bunch of state commissions. He is everywhere and involved with cultural resources of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. And we're very honored to have him tonight again. Let me go back to David. I need to tell you one more thing about David, and sorry, David, I didn't warn you I was going to do this, but I met David in 2015 when he came to Corvallis to give a presentation and a blessing at the Lamprey Creek Awakening. a number of us had worked together to get the creek named as Lamprey Creek. It was the first in the United States to be named after the lamprey. And a friend who worked with us named Gabe Sheaships from the Umatilla Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla. I invited David down to give the keynote presentation at the Awakening and to give a blessing, to bless the creek. And so that was my first meeting. He blew everybody's socks off with his presentation. His blessing was beyond touching. But I need to tell David and the world here that things have happened with Lamprey Creek, and I would love to attribute it to David's blessing. The city of Corvallis went really beyond itself when a housing development was coming that could have really, really damaged Lamprey Creek in many ways. And the city of Corvallis, following this blessing, went beyond anything I've seen them do to protect that creek. And that was a very big effort on the city's part and very well appreciated. And the other thing is the beaver have returned. There's now Beaver Nation in Corvallis. There are so many beaver on Lamprey Creek, and there's beaver dams now that are over 6 feet tall and over 50 feet wide. So David, I'd like to attribute that to your blessing, if you don't mind. Kelly Dirksen is the second and last speaker, and he is the Fish and Wildlife Program Manager for the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Run, and he's been doing this for 26 years. And his job is to protect everything on tribal land and tribally seeded land that has feathers, furs, fins, and flowers. And he does a great job. He manages a team of fish and wildlife biologists and to protect the land, the ecosystems, and the waters of, again, tribal lands and tribally seeded lands. And I think you're going to really enjoy this presentation. And now, and by the way, I want to show you how hard he works. That's Kelly at work, probably in the Santiam. I'm not sure where that is. But take it away, and David Harrelson.
Thank you, Dave. That's gracious of you to say, but I'm very confident that there is many reasons for success of Lamprey Creek. What an honor to be with all of you again for another presentation, 2 presentations in 1 year. We're going to talk about probably some things that you've heard, but one thing that I'm really excited about tonight is we're going to talk more about stories than I think we've ever really had stories presented as a part of these. We've always had a few notes or focuses, but given our inspiration of Coyote, it seemed like a good time to bring out some of those Coyote stories tonight. Another big thank you to the ongoing sponsors for this series, but really Dave, who helps connect all those people and organizations to the cause and this idea of, furthering awareness about Kalapuya people and topics that are important to the tribe and tribal people today. And I'm very grateful for that. Any other things that I should say as a part of the introduction? No, I think I'll just do a quick kind of outline of what to anticipate that we're going to go through, and I will explain this photo later. It'll come back up again. So I'm going to give kind of my introduction, kind of more formal introduction as a tribal member. We're going to talk about time immemorial and the flood story, and then I'm going to share some information about Coyote as a story figure, and then we're going to go into a story about Coyote and the frogs. I'm going to share another story that, while not featuring Coyote, is a prominent story that I think is very applicable to help understand some of the work that we've been doing in restoration. And we're going to talk about cultural understanding informs restoration efforts, like how we sort of have used that at the tribe. And then I'm going to tee it up for Kelly to talk a little bit about what some of the restoration that the tribe's been involved with looks like in one of the river systems in our homelands, and then a conclusion. So you're looking at an image that's in Chechalu Museum and Cultural Center. And as Dave said, you should come visit us. And the good news that I have to share is that you can actually come visit us Tuesday through Friday from 10 to 4. Our doors are back open. There's COVID precautions and mask wearing, but Chechalu is back open. Chechalu is free to community and the public. So please stop by, even if you're just passing through to the coast on a trip. Hopefully you can see a few things. One of those that you'll see is this wall mural of what the Willamette Valley looks like with 400 feet of water in it. But before I get to that and talk about it, I want to talk about my family and sort of the connection that I have to this place, to the Willamette Valley. I guess I'll orient you more. We're on the Coast Range, about 30,000 feet up, looking east at the Cascades. The white peaks that you see at the top of the image are Mount Hood on the left, Mount Jefferson, and then Three Sisters to the south. The islands in the blue area are mountainous areas within the Willamette Valley, such as the Eola Hills, the Salem Hills, and other locations like that. So that's what you're looking at. This is where I'm from. I was not only born in Eugene, Oregon, but my family has been born in this place since time immemorial, since a time that no one can remember. My grandmother is Ellen Fisher, who spent her life working at Chemawa Indian School in Salem. Her father is Freeman Bean, who's the first tribal member in Western Oregon to own his own logging company. And it's said that he made millions 3 times, and depending on who you talk to, he lost it or gave it away each time. His great-grandfather is a man named Joseph Shengretta, and Joseph Shengretta signed the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855 for the Santiam Kalapuya people. But then when he was on the reservation, he was recognized as a headman for the Marys River Kalapuya people. And if you go back into his history, you come to understand that his mother had ties to the Marys River and potentially the Long Tom Kalapuya people. And so that was sort of that connection of becoming a headman for the Marys River Kalapuya, even though he signed the treaty for the Santiam Kalapuya people. And it just speaks to this interconnectivity. A big part of the reason why he was a headman, but besides probably exhibiting many desirable traits of a leader, was that he was educated in Western ways. His father was a trapper, and when his family became ill, his mother died, and they were orphaned, he was actually raised at Jason Lee's Methodist Mission, where his 2 siblings eventually died before they came of age, and he was the only one to make it. So that's a little bit about my family. That's as far back as I can speak in terms of people's names, which is about 8 generations. But it goes back even further than that, right? We say that we've been here as Kalapuya people since time immemorial. And what that means is literally since a time that no one can remember. And why I have this picture up here is because this is the oldest geological event that we have memory of in our oral histories. And in those stories, it talks about how the water increased slow enough that people could run out in front of it and get up into high ground. And that matches up with what scientists took till the 1980s to really begin to recognize and accept, is that there were these huge geological flooding events that happened between 13 and 18,000 years ago. In Oregon, not on the west side, but on the east side of the state, there's archaeology as old as 14,300 years ago. There's some older sites recently found that kind of push that maybe even to 15,000 years ago. Our people have been here a really long time, and we've basically been carrying along those narratives about these events. And so, this whole series is really special to me because it's an ability after so many things that have happened and removal of our people from our homelands on our reservation, to reconnect with a place, reconnect with people who are of that place today that care so much about it and want to learn more. And we're exploring that, and people are learning as we go. And it's been really wonderful to add new topics and kind of expand that thought, even in response to comments and other things that we get. And I think as a collective, the whole Corvallis, but greater community, now that we're virtual, is actually coming to have a greater, significantly greater awareness about some of the history and cultural teachings and awareness. So I'm very thrilled about that, and it's a true honor to be a part of it. Coyote. So this is an image of a coyote mask. It's a coyote mask that is owned by our community and danced in our longhouse. It has a special tie to our large canoe, Stonkia, which is a Clackamas word meaning coyote. And we named that canoe Coyote because coyote is a changer, and that's how Coyote's known in the old stories, as a trickster figure, as a changer that helped put the world in order for humans. And we named the first canoe that we built in our community that we had made, we named it Coyote because we knew that it was going to bring a change with it into the community as we started to engage in different cultural practices around the canoe. Coyote stories are immense, and you'll find coyote stories across the whole Pacific Northwest, both coastal Pacific Northwest, inland Northwest, as far south as California, up into British Columbia. Coyote is a very prevalent figure in those stories and often fills that same type of role. There's hundreds of indigenous coyote stories. There's hundreds of indigenous coyote stories from just Western Oregon. One book resource that I would recommend really strongly as a general access reader is a book by Gerald Ramsey called Coyote Was Going There. And Gerald Ramsey, as far back in the 1970s, posited that there was a literature of Oregon, and that literature was actually an Indian literature of Oregon, and that Native people and our storytelling traditions that have been documented by anthropologists and also by continued living communities today have maintained a literature that is tied to the space of Oregon Territory, or the broader Oregon, what Oregon was when it included Washington and Idaho and all of Oregon. And so we have these stories that that portray human-like characteristics to this coyote figure going across the landscape, interacting with geographic places and other plants and animals, essentially making way for the world. I think that what's oftentimes most surprising to people is that these stories don't fit into your typical good-evil dichotomy that a lot of Western narrative and stories that have that. The stories really relate to the lived human experience, and they center imperfectness, paradox, and how selfishness makes life harder. It's said that Coyote's house was the highest up, and this is why we named creeks on the creeks on Mary's Peak recently. We named the highest up creek on Mary's Peak Osney, the Kalapuya word for coyote. And I know many of you have connections to the Corvallis area and Mary's Peak, so I wanted to kind of bring attention to that. Stonkia is the Clackamas word for coyote, whereas Osney is the central Kalapuya word for the coyote. So there's a lot more to be done, and we're only going to talk about like really one coyote story and one other story today. But there's many, many stories, and I encourage you to look into that. And the book that I referenced is a good way to go about it. This is a picture that was actually taken of a frog in the planter strip at Chichalu Museum and Cultural Center, which is in a partnership with our native plant nursery, is filled with pollinator plants. And it's a wonderful thing and an experiment. Since it's in the parking lot, everything blooms a little bit faster than where it does out in colder environments, wetter, cooler environments. And so it allows us to kind of anticipate when different plants are blooming to go out and gather and do other interactions. But we also get these visitors like frogs. And it was a picture I had of a frog. It's from a friend, Jay Oyo. Maybe he's on the call tonight. So kudos to Jay for getting this picture of a frog. Coyote and the frogs. As a Kalapuya person, this is one of our Kalapuya stories that our elders told a long time ago to an anthropologist. There's still people in community who talk about this story or reference different aspects of it. And there's many tellings of the story too. There's not just one. But the story begins with Coyote going along, like many of the stories of Coyote. And Coyote comes across a small dead deer, and he eats it, and he sets aside a small rib. And from that rib, he makes a dentilium bead. So dentilium are a money bead. It's like a currency for Indian people. Indian money, haikwa is another name for it. But he makes a dentilium, a money bead, of the little rib of the deer. What you need to understand at the time of Coyote before people, or before all the people came, there were still people, a few people here or there, but not all the people, is that frogs kept all the water, and they stood guard over the water all the time. And they had all the water dammed up in one place. The people always bought water from the frogs, the few people that were around, the few animals as Coyote was making his way through the world. And when Coyote arrived at the water, he offered the money bead he made from the deer rib. And he told those frogs, I want to drink a lot of water. I have a large dentilium, large money bead. And they agreed. So Coyote put his hand down in the water where it was dammed off, and when he was done drinking, he rose and scooped the dirt away. Now then the water went on through and out, and Coyote said, there will be water everywhere for all time. And this is one of our stories about Coyote's interaction with the frogs who were keeping all the water and not allowing it to go places. And why we have water throughout our whole landscape today is because Coyote saw it fit to make sure that water would be everywhere for all time. There's a lot of reflections that I think you can make with this about different values and how water is used and the need for universally accessible water and the functions of it. But at its core, it's a simple story with a simple message, and it explains why water is in many places today. Another story that we have is the Skookum and Wonderful Boy. Skookum is a monster. It's a common word that's used amongst our different tribal peoples to describe various monsters that live in different places. This story is referencing a hill monster. And these are images of different fish and a waterfall on the left, and in the lower right you actually have a fishing platform off of a rock. And now I'll talk a little bit about this story. On the east side of Willamette Falls, near today Oregon City, there was a large fishing village. Its chief was a great man. And a Skookum, a monster, came out of the mountains from the east, and he killed the whole village, except for the chief's wife and their unborn son. After the son's birth, the woman, wanting him to be strong, took him to all the streams and lakes with spirit powers and bathed him in each one. This made him very strong, and he grew up fast. As he grew, he asked his mother about the items in the village, like the spears for fishing, his father's axe that it used to kill enemies and cut wood with, and the bow and arrow his father used to hunt. One day, he took his father's axe, and he went into the woods. Almost immediately, he met the skookum. He drove his axe into a gnarly log so as to make a big crack. He then challenged the monster. If you are so strong, why don't you hold this crack open while I take another cut? The stupid skookum put his fingers in the crack. The boy pulled his axe, and the skookum was caught, so the boy killed him easily. He then took his father's bow, and he shot an arrow high into the sky, making a prayer in the same moment that those that died should come back to life. As the arrow hit the earth, the chief and all the people came upriver in canoes. They landed at the rocks and began fishing as if nothing had happened. The boy was very happy and went down to meet his father, whom he had never seen before. Not recognizing him, the chief said, "Who are you? I am chief here." And then he hit him. This made him very sad, and he climbed up the rocks above the falls and turned himself into a salmon. The noise of the falls bothered him so much that he made his way upriver, stopping at each river along the way, but not being able to rest there. Eventually he came to the mouth of the Santiam and found a nice place. It was there that Coyote found him on his journeys and turned him into a crescent-shaped rock. From then on, to this day, all the fish ascending the falls proceeded to the Santiam, and after circling the crescent-shaped rock, salute Wonderful Boy and proceed up the clear Santiam. So this is this really powerful story that describes the events of what's to be the first fish that ascends the falls. And the ability for the fish to actually ascend the falls comes from not a fish's ability to jump a waterfall, but actually it being a person that climbs over the falls and turns themselves into a fish, essentially running away from an act of doing good, right? Bringing their people back into the world. I think that there's a lot of power in that, and it's also connecting across cultural geographies and people. You know, you're connecting like culturally Chinook people of Willamette Falls upriver to the Santiam River and understanding this interconnectedness. And there was something really powerful about this. It was actually maybe almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago, people in our office were kind of rereading stories and thinking about places, and we had come to realize that a lot of these old stories that elders had said or elders talked about in community corresponded to geological places and events, but those geological places or events might not be as known or as interacted with as recently. And so we started to set out to try to re-identify some of these places, whether it was different rock-like features, carved rocks, petroglyphs, and a part of our work in the Cultural Resources Department was to document the continued presence of those places on the landscape. And this was a really exciting project because we actually re-identified the crescent-shaped rock, and we employed all types of technology to do that. What needs to be understood is that mouths of rivers move. And so when we first looked at the mouth of the Santiam River, we didn't find the rock. And then we said, well, let's look at historic maps. Where was the mouth of the river in the 1850s? And we were able to find it was about a quarter mile away. And when we looked there, we still didn't quite see it. But knowing that there's this new type of mapping called LIDAR, and a certain type of LIDAR that can actually look just a little bit beneath the surface and help capture what might be different flows of the river, we actually found the crescent-shaped rock at the old mouth of the Santiam River. And that was before the tribe began acquiring these lands that today the tribe has acquired lands for conservation on the Santiam River. And one of those things that drove that desire was, you know, this reference to the clear Santiam River, right, which is in this old story. And I remember this moment where we're talking with one of the biologists who works at the tribe, and we were saying, you know, there's this story and it says that basically all the fish are supposed to go up this river. And they said, well, you know, the North Santiam River has some of the best spawning habitat in the whole, like above Willamette Falls within the Willamette system. And we went, no way, that's amazing. Like science and culture sort of like, you know, matching up and supporting each other and kind of looking at that work. So that was one of the reasons why when we sought out conservation parcels to bring into ownership of the tribe, you know, our homeland stretch across Western Oregon. You know, the tribe would love to see restoration happen in all those places and be a part of it, but we only have so many resources. And so we had to think about and prioritize what those places were. And this is one of the reasons why the Santiam watershed was focused on. It's not to say that the other rivers aren't important though as well, right? Like rivers that may be on the west side, like the Yamhill or the Tualatin or the Marys River, they're oftentimes a little bit more silty, but they make really good lamprey habitat, right? And lamprey, or eels, as we call them in community, are this anadromous fish, even like salmon, but they have these large suckers, and they bury themselves down in the silt. So it's not to rank things, right? There's just like different places where different things thrive. So we re-identified Wonderful Boy Rock. We're really excited about that. The other part of the Santiam River is it abuts an area that was to be a reservation. There were a series of unratified treaties in Western Oregon. The first round of treaties that Westerners made with tribes allowed tribes to stay within their homelands and not confederate with other tribal people. And so if those treaties would have been ratified by Congress, individual tribal people would have had their own reservations. There would have been a Lucky Mute reservation, a Santiam reservation, a Santiam Molalla reservation, a Yamhill reservation, a Tualatin reservation. Instead, we have a Grand Round Indian reservation where those people were forced to come onto one reservation and confederate with each other. But that reservation, the Santiam Kalapuya reservation, abuts the river. And the general feeling that we have from reading minutes from those treaty minutes and other things is that tribes chose some of their most important hunting and fishing grounds and resource gathering areas and village sites. They chose their reservations to be within those core areas. And so as a general practice, the tribe really prioritizes engagement within those historic reservation areas. And so that's sort of what led us to this journey of the Santiam and getting us connected to this place and beginning to look at how can we acquire properties, and then once we acquire them, what are we going to do to be able to make them accessible and improve for, you know, tribal use, ecosystem services, and the like. I just have a couple quick conclusions before I turn it over to Kelly to talk about some of the tribal projects. Cultural information can and should inform restoration efforts. Coyote stories are often confused as fables, but really they fit a lot more of the typology of like what a parable is. And it's kind of confusing because a lot of times fables will have like an anthropomorphic reference, so like bringing human-like characteristics to animals. But what fables are about is like teaching a lesson. And what I see a lot of people read coyote stories for, and it kind of relates to even the teaser that we got you maybe on this call with, is what can we learn from coyote? Well, you know, coyote stories are more about parables. They're about the human condition and about understanding through the eyes of the lived experience of coyote, or the ways or the things that he does, about humans and about interactions. And they're really meant to provoke thought, have ongoing interpretation, reinterpretation over time, as opposed to being like what often things where people and animals are the same. They're not necessarily there to like teach a lesson. And I think that that's just an important consideration, is like as we're looking at coyote stories. I know I've also been told by elders, like, how dare you, you know, try to determine what a coyote story means, because there's almost something that it's like timeless. Like, you can maybe think you know what a coyote story means, and then out of a whole nother context you read it and it means something else entirely. And so the main takeaway that I have about what coyote can teach us is to pay attention and to listen and to reinterpret and to consider all those different facets and aspects, the connectivity of things. These are all things that, as a part of a world of coyote, like, you have to look at introspection, right? This idea of like the fallacy of things, that things aren't a simple dichotomy of good and evil. That is inherent within like teachings of coyote. Although if I said as much, I would probably have elders admonish me, because it's presumptive to say what coyote stories mean. And that's this unique challenge that we live in. Enough of my musing. I should turn it over to Kelly, and thank you for listening. And we should have some time at the end for questions, so feel free to add those in.
Well, I hope everyone can hear me. I am really grateful to have this opportunity to speak to you this evening, and that you have dedicated some time to hear what we had to say. I am extremely blessed to have 5 really dedicated biologists that have done most of the work that I'm going to take credit for this evening. I am always a little bit hesitant to follow Dave Harrelson, who's a great public speaker and has interesting stories, but I had read that it was going to be about water, and I thought, like, oh, we do quite a bit with water, and so I might be able to pull this off. I was later informed that it's more about management and how our management affects water. So my presentation got a bit drier, and if you didn't catch that, I'm kicking this off with a really bad pun. But I am really excited about the work we're doing, and I hope to do that justice tonight. I'm talking about the Chehalpam and Chincowan properties that are on the North Santiam. As Dave points out, this is a really productive system. If you're a fish, the properties are about 6 miles apart. If you're a crow, they're a bit less than 5. My plan this evening is to talk about the goals of managing this property and touch on how the river influences the history of the property and informs our management decisions, and in some cases complicates what we need to do on the land. And then I also want to touch on how we think we have a way of influencing the quality of the water adjacent to these properties. But before I can get into too much of that, I need to touch on how the properties are acquired. So the Army Corps of Engineers built 13 dams in the Willamette Basin. 8 of these generate electricity. The Bonneville Power Administration runs the hydroelectric facilities to address issues related to effects on wildlife from operating these hydroelectric facilities. The BPA struck a deal with the state of Oregon to acquire 16,800 acres to be set aside for conservation. Neither of those parties are interested in acquiring and managing lands themselves, so that opportunity is open to others, and that's what we have done and pursued. And so that's what we're looking at. 2 properties that we have purchased under this program. Chehalpam was acquired, or started being acquired, in 2012, and about every 3 years another parcel was added until it added up to 462 acres. Chincowan, which is a bit upstream, is 425 acres, and it was acquired in 2016. Our goals for managing this property is to heal the land and to return it as best we can to its historical functional condition. Our other goal is to reconnect the tribal membership to these lands that have such a cultural and historic value. We're also on the hook for managing for the conservation values that occur on these properties as part of our conservation easement. And then long-term, we hope to open some access to the public to these properties. So I told you I was going to talk about how the river influenced these properties in the past. And, you know, there's ag, there's other development that affects the flow of the river, but probably the biggest thing is the Detroit and Big Cliff dams that are just upstream. So what's in front of you is a hydrograph of the flows of the Santiam River from 1905 to 2019. Right in the middle there is when the Detroit and Big Cliff dams were constructed. And the red lines you see represent flood events that were greater than 20,000 cubic feet per second. We think this is about the level of flow where the river starts to crest the banks. And that has important implications for wildlife that I'll tell you about in a minute. The point I'm trying to make here is that floods were much more frequent before the dams than they were after. So floods were occurring at about 1.8 times a year prior to the dams. After the dams, the chances of a flood are about 30% for a given year. So what do the floods do? Well, every time the river crests the bank, it's going to go to the easiest way that it can go, and that's typically these side channels. And as it does that, it'll flush out sediments, it'll bring in new nutrients and large woody debris, and provide a really important habitat component for spawning and rearing salmon and lamprey. It's also really critical to a species I'm going to talk about in here in a minute. And how that is affected is really easiest to see if you look at a LiDAR image. I'm hoping that your resolution at home shows some of this. So you can see the river has moved around a bunch, and we can look at the way it's moved over time. So this is where the Santiam River was expected or was mapped to be in 1852. In 1936, it had wandered back more onto the Chehalpin property. And in 2018, it's where we see it now. This configuration of the river probably dates back to at least 1963 and hasn't changed from that moment in time. What you can also see if you look back on some of the aerial photos is that there's a big push to acquire lands next to the river, and then people work their tail off to keep the river off their land, and that's kind of reflected in the revetment that I hope you can see on the east side of the property here. Those side channels are really critical to, or almost required for one really endearing and tenacious species that's shown in your upper right there. That's the Oregon chub. This species has made a living by being able to hunker down during the high flows, and then as the flows recede on these side channels, to use that slack water to generate the next generation of chub. And they do this amazingly well if you have natural conditions. This channel, the pond that you see in the middle image here, is part of that old channel that was part of 1936, the main channel in 1936. It's changed a lot since then, and without these natural flows, the advantage goes to non-native species. So bullfrogs, pumpkin seed, smallmouth bass, and crappie all are out competing this critter. There was around 4,000 chub in this pond in 2014. We have about 100, maybe less now. So you kind of get stuck with what can you do to restore a historic condition? We can't have much of an influence on the dams, but we can create something that's similar to what was occurring historically. And so what we have done is acquired funds to restore this channel. Over the last 2 years, we found $250,000 to restore the channel, create a flow control structure where we aim to shunt quite a bit of water and a significant flow back to this pond. Let chub do what they normally do, and then hopefully usher out the unwanted guests that we have there now. So I'm hoping that maybe I get invited back a few years from now. We can talk about how it works. Otherwise, I'll probably ignore invitations in the near or long-term future. So it's not just the river that influences these lands, it's also humans themselves, and that's best seen again by looking at the property over time. So this is Chunkowan in 1852. This is in 1936. You can see the river still actively flowing over the land, and there isn't much human development of the site, probably because the river was flowing over the land. By 1963, there's significant changes. Most of the merchantable timber has been removed. Most of the open areas that you see on the image are being utilized for ranging cattle. That gets a little more solidified in 93, and then shortly, well, from 93 to present, there's not a lot of management of the site. And so what you see now is a property that has about an 8-acre chunk out of it that was utilized for timber sales. The areas that ranged cattle now grow Scotch broom at a really alarming rate. And you can see a similar story at Chihalpum. So this is Chihalpum in 1936. You can see the rivers where I showed it was in 36, and there's not a ton of agriculture on the site. But that changes by the time of our acquisition or reacquisition in 2018. And about 195 of those acres are in ag. So I talked about how we can have an influence, a positive influence on the river. And I think the best way to do that and to improve water next to these properties is through healing and by improving the riparian zones on these lands. So a properly functioning riparian zone next to that river would be growing large trees, some of which would fall in the river and produce large woody debris that's important habitat component for a variety of species. The riparian areas themselves are amazingly productive for Oregon wildlife. They capture and release water and have a filter function for the water that makes it back to the stream. And in this case, on Chihalpum has another issue. So as you can see, a lot of it has been in ag. If it's not in ag, it's going to grow Scotch broom and blackberry at a really fast rate. So you kind of bite the bullet and we lease it out to farming. That carries with it another side, which means that for a farmer to have an interest in leasing it, you have to give them the tools that they believe they need to draw profit. And that means you inherit a long list of chemicals that can go onto the land and eventually can make it into the river. So best thing we can do to address that is to phase out ag, and that's what we're starting to do. So field 16 that's on the left there was planted last week. Field 15 was planted the year before. Field 7 will be planted next year in January or February. And it is a long-term process, and when I say planting, it's never quite that simple. I was going to have my next slide explain the difficulties of doing the work by showing a big dollar sign, because that is part of it. That's even too cheesy for me. So I'll just tell you that what we are doing does involve a lot of dollars. And we've been fortunate to have a team that can tap into partners that really want to see this work continue. We have Lindsay McClary, who's generated over $2 million to do restoration work on the lands. And she's developed partners that provide technical and financial assistance to do the work. Partners like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, the Meyer Memorial Fund. All of these folks and others have contributed to managing these, providing the funds and technical assistance. And we go big. So we do, for riparian restoration, we do the R3 method, which means that we're aiming for a canopy closure within 5 to 7 years. And to get to that, we're planting 2,200 to 2,600 stems per acre. This is both the understory and the eventual overstory for the site. It's an aggressive way to go, and it's obviously, it has bigger upfront costs, but the idea is that it will work better long-term and reduce costs down range. This has worked successfully for a number of watershed councils in the valley, and early signs for us is that it's working pretty well for us too. I'll just show you, that's the farm field before it was planted. That's the field shortly after it was planted. Not every field is an ag field that you can just plop trees into. A lot of it needs work to where you have to remove blackberry or Scotch broom before you can do any planting. And then there's also habitat goals that we have, like oak savanna, where we'll never grow oak to a canopy closure that's going to shade anything out, which means you have to come back and be able to manage, remove the brush, doing whether it's mowing or brushing with a skid steer. So to that, we have purchased last year about $500,000 worth of equipment that includes the skid steer that you see in the image now. If you're a biologist or you're someone that's had to trudge through blackberry or Scotch broom, there's nothing more therapeutic than running that skid steer. I'd hope everyone has a chance to drive it for a half an hour at some point if you've ever had to be around blackberry. I tend to think that if a person had 2 or 3 of these and a couple good operators, they probably could rule the world, maybe the Northwest. We can probably keep a few of these busy with the acres that we have now. So I'm going to wrap up just telling you what we've done and what we've accomplished to this point. We haven't been managing since acquisition. Before we can do any restoration work, we have to have an approved plan through the BPA. So at Chehalpin, that occurred 2 years ago. So we have 2 years of restoration under our belt. At Chunkowan, it's only been 1 year. And at Chehalpin to date, we have planted 81,801 stems. We've demolished and removed 5 structures. We've removed 20 acres of brush, mostly blackberry. We've removed about 25 tons of garbage, and it's not on the list, but we've also manually removed Lowigia, an aquatic invasive species, out of the pond at least twice. We can tell a similar story at Chunkowan. So Chunkowan, we've planted 10,600 plants. We've removed 7 structures. We've removed a staggering 243 tons of garbage. I'm afraid we're not done on that side. We've treated for fuel reduction about 20 acres. This site, Chunkowan, is within 4 miles of the Beachy Creek fire of last year, so that became a bit more relevant, and we assumed the ignition site would be more likely close to the highway, and so that's why we've treated the northern 20 acres. We've reforested the 8 acres that were high graded a few years ago, and we've removed 25 acres of Scotch broom. And if some of you are still awake, you might notice that my legend says we were going to do 99 acres. You might also remember we had the heat dome last year, so that bumped up our fire restrictions. We only really tackled 25. I think that's pretty much all I've got. I again appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks, and I guess I'll leave it up to the MC to figure out what we do from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you so much, David. If we could have David and Kelly on screen, I could go through some of the questions that we've gotten so far. And please do keep sending your questions this way. We'd love to answer them, and we do have some time tonight. Since we were just looking at it, Kelly, Marta asks, what are you planting? Are those trees that you're planting?
Yes, it is a bunch of trees. So it's primarily for the overstory, it's going to be western red cedar, some black cottonwood, alder. The understory, we have Pacific 9-bark, snowberry, red elderberry, red osier dogwood, and some Oregon grape.
Awesome. Thanks. And then someone asked pretty early on in the presentation, are there any places that people could donate to help support and further the work that you both do? For example, one of the things they mentioned is, would it be appropriate to donate to the Chechalu Museum? Or Kelly, like, how could we donate to help with your work if someone wanted to do that?
Well, I'll let Dave cover the museum issue first, if you will.
Yeah,
Dave.
yeah. Chechalu Museum and Cultural Center absolutely takes donations. Would be very grateful. We're working on a couple other types of outlets at the tribe. We're hearing more and more people's desire to pay rent for lands that are indigenous lands, and so the tribe's looking at potential future avenues for that. I'm working on some exciting work around the arts, and looking at sort of ways to fund indigenous arts, but that's all kind of future forecasting, maybe future presentations. For environmental sort of work specific, I'll let Kelly give a run at it.
I am always willing to take people's money, but I don't know of a mechanism that we can accept money to do the work that we are doing. Eventually, we're going to get to public access on the properties. Folks will be able to call in and get a permit and access the properties. And I think one thing that will help us down the road is positive feedback from the public about utilizing these properties, which will give us a leg up on funding that we'll secure to manage the properties from the other funders. So that I guess that would be my best advice.
Yeah, and in lieu of the tribe really building those structures, something that I would really recommend is donations to your local watershed council. Watershed councils, generally operate with lots of volunteer time, very little resources, and they leverage those resources really, really well. And I know that our tribe has, really valued partnerships that we've built with watershed councils, but it's also sort of a universal across the tribe's homelands, is that pretty much every watershed has a nonprofit sort of built around supporting that watershed.
Great, thank you. And I did put in the Chechalu Museum and Cultural Center. I put that link in the chat for the audience. So if you do want to find out more, or that's of interest to you, please explore. A question for Kelly. How does awareness of the deep tribal cultural history on the Santiam influence how you approach this scientific and management work?
Well, I think Dave touched on some of it earlier, that we first had to know that there was a cultural value and connection to the property to pursue the acquisition or reacquisition to begin with. After that, we work with our cultural department folks to make sure that our actions are in line with the tribal values and that we don't disrupt culturally sensitive sites as we do the work that we're doing out there. I think that's probably the best answer I can think of giving.
Great, thank you.
I might just piggyback a little bit on that and say, the other part is that commitment that the biologists and, the staff that's doing the active restoration, having that goal of getting people out on the properties also helps because as that starts to happen, you're getting interactions between, scientists and cultural practitioners just through proximity of interaction in that space. And so whether it's, more formally through review channels where that's happening at like the staff to staff level, where people are wearing different hats, like that sort of starts the conversation. But also as it goes on, right, people like providing feedback about, or they're planning things now and there'll be things that are ready to harvest. And when they are, people will be out on that site making observations and being able to interact and have feedback. And so it's dynamic. It doesn't happen all at once, right? It's to use a comparison, to do good work that's relevant, it's more like gardening than it is like architecture, right? Like you can't like just completely design everything and know how it's going to work out perfectly. Like you have to try stuff out, you have to do this. And meanwhile, as Kelly pointed out, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of money, right? So it's not as if everything's just known. There's, to me, it's like a cultural laboratory is what I feel like I'm like observing and seeing. And our biologists and scientists are just as important part of that as like cultural practitioners, right? But everyone has their roles that they sort of serve within that structure.
Yeah, I like that. I think one of the things that that we face is like before you hand the keys off for folks to enjoy the land, you want to clean it up first. And so I don't think we've really tapped into all that we think we can do on these properties and all that our cultural department folks can help us to reconnect the membership with the land. Right now, it's just trying to solve some immediate conservation needs on the property. But I think we have a really positive working relationship within the tribe, and I get excited about what's going to happen 5-10 years from now as we see changes occurring and as we have folks have other ideas about what can happen there. Because some of these things, like the pond that supports chub, it can also grow apatow, another species that's important to the tribe that has probably a more tangible benefit. We see things like that, and we are coming across issues like that fairly regularly, but at this moment, it feels like the most immediate thing is just healing the land and getting the land back on its feet.
Great, thank you. Lindsay asks, what is the native name for the Santiam?
So the Santiam Kalapuya people, their name for themselves is the Halpum. That's actually why the property is called Chahalpum. Cha means the place of something, and Halpum is their name for themselves. The name of the river itself, I'm not sure what that is. It's not on the top of my mind. I'm sure there's listeners that know. There's so many things to know that I'm not quite sure. I will say, since we named the property Chungcowan, Cowan is salmon, so the place of the salmon is the name of that other parcel, kind of evoking that idea of it being, the preferred river for fish that come up the river with that story from Wonderful Boy. One thing that we are unfortunate in some ways that a lot of the watersheds are named after or associated with the same names that the cultural groups that lived in those watersheds. And so there's a certain recognizableness when I say Yamhill Kalapuya, people probably have an idea that's probably where the Yamhill River is. Or if I say Tualatin Kalapuya, it's probably where the Tualatin River is, or the Lucky Mute, or the Marys River, or the Santiam. That starts to, Long Tom, right? Like all those become sort of like familiarity. There's a few that don't follow that structure, but for the most part, our watersheds are named after, or vice versa, the tribal groups named after the what they name the watershed. And that's not that way in a lot of places in the country, but it helps geographically kind of have an understanding or gateway for some indigenous understanding.
That's really interesting, thank you. Someone's asking, is there any way to volunteer with restoration of these lands?
I'll make a plug, which is Institute for Applied Ecology is a group based out of Corvallis. Probably many of you know about their organization. If you don't, you should look into it. They have a lot more opportunities than we do for volunteering. Some of those volunteer opportunities, though, are with us. And one site that we've actually been partnering together with, or a couple, Herbert Farms near Corvallis and close to probably many of you, as well as Champoeg State Park, where we've been actively doing some prairie restoration work. And I just scheduled a whole planning event for a large outdoor event sometime in the next year at Champoeg. So we're having planning events about that. But if you are looking for restoration opportunities that really make a difference, probably the best way I would say is to look at Institute for Applied Ecology's website, or contact your local watershed council, follow them on social media, and look for the opportunities that come up there. Is that good, Kelly?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I always feel like I have the downer side of it, and for us, it has been difficult to do the internal clearances for volunteers. So we are still wrestling with some of that. And a lot of the work we're doing right now is contracted and doesn't lend itself as much to volunteer work. But I do think there are some really interesting things that are going to come up in the near future. There's going to be a lot of recreational opportunities for development on these properties. So trail work, there's a number of opportunities for monitoring to make sure we're on track for what we wanted to do with the property. So I think if we work out our difficulties with bringing volunteers in, we will have the work. So it's a terrible answer. I'd say kind of check back if you're really interested in working with the tribe.
Yeah, I can relate, Kelly. It's tricky.
Great, thank you. Rick asks, what are attainable things small landowners can do on their own properties to help with restoration?
Yeah, if a couple of things that I recommend right out, besides that Watershed Council, plug the Watershed Council, is the Natural Resource Conservation Service has a lot of resources for local individuals, as well as county soil and water conservation districts. They actively have programming, sometimes even funding and grant, whether it's a pollinator hedgerow, whether it's access to plant material. Some cities actually throughout the Willamette Valley have programs to provide plant material of native plants to local citizens for planting in riparian corridors, if you have property that backs up against a riparian property. So those are sort of the three main places that I would say universally, no matter where you're at, in Oregon at least, but a lot of those are national programs too. So if we have anyone tuning in from afar throughout the US, Natural Resource Conservation Service, has their national resources. So again, Soil and Water Conservation District, NRCS, as the term is often said, and your watershed councils.
Fantastic, thank you. This is a question for Kelly. Hopefully I'm understanding it. What if any restoration is planned for the riverbed banks adjoining the two properties?
Okay. Well, one of the big things that we want to address, but it is long-term and very difficult, is the revetment I talked about at Chalcombe. So that really fixes where the river is now and provides a, I don't know, 800-foot long rip-rap bank that the river is hitting now. So it's not providing a ton of diversity. That is a long-term goal. That's difficult. A lot of what we are seeing along the shore is just that it was poorly stocked, or it was utilized for revenue. Folks harvested it within the riparian zone. So it's a lot of riparian planting and addressing those stocking issues. I'm trying to think of other issues. I can't think of too many problems right along the bank, but I do know that we have found the Oregon chub in the Chuncowan property in a tiny little side channel that's still fairly moderately active on Chuncowan. And so what we learn at Chehalpam in restoring the flow there, we plan to apply at this other site and restore flow and the conditions for the chub at that site. And that's a lot of what I can think of for right at the shoreline.
Great, thank you. And then Craig asks, I believe this is for Kelly as well, what kind of structures did you have to remove? What types of garbage are there?
Oh, yes, my favorite. The properties came with, because they were mostly agricultural ranching, they had homes. Chuncowan had 2 homes, a trailer park, a barn, or not trailer park, a mobile home, a barn, and then 3 or 4 outbuildings. So all of those were demolished and removed. Then we brought in dumpsters to just remove garbage from the site. So I don't think the previous owners ever had a garbage bill. I think what we are finding is there's decades of household garbage, and that's most of what it is. It's appliances, it's just household garbage, including some tires and other things like that. At Chehalpam, we removed 3 houses and 1 barn. We left 1 standing because it was in great condition, and we think it will provide a great meeting space for folks that want to come out to the site, and has creates a bunch of opportunities there. But the issue there is that it is not yet gated, and so it has some prime opportunities to dump continually. And so I think we've had cases where we've gone out there and done work, and before we've left, we found new garbage at the start of the site. So at Chehalpam, we've removed 25 tons of garbage. I suspect we're going to remove, until we get the access issue resolved, we're going to remove a bunch more.
You know, with the likelihood that there may be quite a few restoration people tuning in, I guess I just want to add that one other thing that I think is a big competitive advantage for the, you know, not only is it the right thing for the tribe to reacquire these lands that are our homelands and take care of them in a good way, but very few restoration organizations have ready access that isn't through contracts to cultural resource professionals and archaeologists. And with all those sites and that project and federal money being involved, it means that we have to follow those regulations. And that in a lot of cases might delay or result in large project costs through added contractors, whereas the tribe is able to assist with archaeology staff that we have on hand that already do our timber surveys on the reservation and do work out at the tribe itself. You know, it's not unlimited, but the ability to work that in over time as, you know, really great planning work is happening and we know where it needs to go, and then we can kind of move our staff into place to help with that. I think that that's something that has kind of helped minimize like what become kind of unexpected costs when people think about restoration. And I think it's, you know, of course I'm proud of it because it's our staff and cultural resources that are contributing that, but it is a consideration for restoration. And, you know, our office consults with a lot of restoration activity throughout our homelands. And generally, you know, those organizations are having to contract with other organizations, which slows down their timeline, even if they have the added funding. And it's been a real advantage, I think, to keeping kind of nimble project implementation on these sites with historic buildings and trash coming out of things and just making, you know, informed decisions like that is archaeology, that is not archaeology. So.
Great, thank you. This question is for David. You told us some really great stories tonight. Do you have a recommendation for like the best collection of stories from Native people from the Willamette Valley? Are there any stories that, or a book that you'd recommend or anything like that?
Yeah, there hasn't been just one book kind of put together for Willamette Valley stories. Most of the stories that have been published are kind of a part of anthologies and collections. And that anthology that is still, I think it stood the test of time, is the best one to reference, and it's categorized by region. So you have the ability to look, and it's Coyote Was Going There by Gerald Ramsey. It was published in the 1970s. There's been a few versions of it that have been put out. It's University of Washington Press.
Great, thanks. Jotting that down. Perfect, thank you. This sort of ties into actually our very first event in the series, so I think I'll just throw it out there, even though it's not specifically about water. What role do you hope for fire to play on these properties? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can cover some of that if you want, Dave. So part of the management plan is to use fire, and Dave can speak more about the historic cultural use of fire. But within our natural resources office, we do have a wildland fire crew, a number of wildland engines, and really qualified staff. And it's a direction that we plan to move because fire was a natural component of the landscape. It's tricky in that we are near urban areas in some cases, and requires folks with really high skills and qualifications. I think we have that with the crews that we have. And so I'm hoping we will see that and do plan on utilizing that much more in the future.
Yeah, I'm really excited about capacity when these environments, once the plannings have matured to a point where the opportunity of exposing fire is possible. I get really excited about it because it becomes like that laboratory space, right? Of like testing things. And it's one thing for the tribe, you know, if you're testing something out for the first time, right? It's like you're testing out a recipe. You try it out on your family first, right? Before your friends come over. And if the tribe wants to see people doing this with fire, I think it'll benefit us. We have the capacity of a burn crew. Now we have the lands where that can happen. But as Kelly said, we're cleaning the place up a little bit, right? You can't just lay fire on the ground and expect that it's going to be productive. But I'm excited about it, being a tool, hopefully a tool that is a cost-effective tool, right? And we can see that or show it like, this is what it costs to mow this area, and this area we used fire. And, our hypothesis is that if you can do that effectively, it's going to save a lot of money in the comparative cost. But that's our hypothesis, right? We need to test it out, and we can't do that until we have environments that can handle fire in a good way, and there has to be work, there has to be cleanup done before that can happen.
Sure, thank you. So Patricia asks, and she says, the main stem Willamette River channels and its tributaries relied on physical and other changes, includes hydrological disturbances, to maintain the ecological functions of these channel reaches. How would you say that this thought applies to the side channel that is being restored, and how can those processes be included long-term in this restoration project?
Does anyone know a coyote who can put their hand? Oh wait, that's something else. But I don't, that's just not having to put Kelly in the spot to say, essentially, if you're providing, they're doing a great job of providing for flood control, right? Without flooding, how can you expect a dynamic system and knowing where it would? And acquiring almost 1,000 acres of land isn't nearly enough to mitigate the impacts of what flooding would happen. So, I mean, I guess I'll just kind of leave it there, and that, yeah, maybe I'll just add the other part that it's really good to bring up, that people think about rivers being static, But as you saw from Kelly's maps, they're not static and they moved, and they used to move a lot more than they move today. And through revetment and channelization, you know, the whole landscape of the Willamette Valley looks really different. I was amazed to talk with some hydrologists and geologists that were talking about sedimentation rates in the lower Willamette system, and that, you know, there was something like a 1/4 inch a year on an island near Corvallis in the Willamette River, and it was like, you know, things like there's a lot of sedimentation sort of like happening, and that just really changes the system without, you know, a lot of dramatic flooding. Did I save you from that one, Kelly?
I don't know. I think that's a really hard question, because the reality is the river did move a ton more than it has. And how are we going to mimic some of those conditions in the lands that we do have? And we are limited. I mean, the project that we're working on is a $250,000 project to do one small side channel. So you can't scale that up too much and not run out of funds to do the work. I do think that, I mean, some of the long-term goals are like to address that revetment. You know, we can acquire lands to where we don't have to worry as much about what other adjacent landowners are going to say if the river crests its banks, if we already own that land. And that's kind of true with some of these properties we're looking at. We're not as nervous about fire. We're not nervous about flooding because they were natural events that occurred at the site. But it is tough because we're going to have a really hard time duplicating what has occurred in the past. Now there's recreation behind those dams, there's water supply behind those dams, and they do have a flood control value. But they're also, as far as electricity, they're only providing 4% of the power that BPA utilizes in their inventory. And so we're getting close to a point where the cost of running the dams for hydroelectricity is not super profitable. And so maybe we can start looking at ways that we can adjust flows that still protect for flooding, but increase flows in the valley. And we've seen some of that even at dams like Fall Creek, where we've been involved in a lamprey project to reestablish lamprey above Fall Creek, and the reason it works there is that they lower that dam to near run of the river. So Chinook are able to get out, lamprey are able to get out, still meets its flood control status, but it's also it's taking innovative looks at what folks are doing and looking for ways that it can improve the environment without cost aimed at related to the things that the dams were put in to begin with. I feel like I rambled, but it is a really tough issue to cover.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Thank you, though, for both of your answers. And we probably really only have time for about one more, so I'll throw this one out here. It's from Amy. Are there any particularly strong Oregon examples of tribal knowledge, history, cultural practices, and/or stories that are meaningfully shaping restoration projects that aren't being led by tribes? Are y'all familiar with anything like that?
The project that comes to mind, and I'm not as familiar with it, Kelly and I haven't even ever talked about it, but the fish weir efforts along the lower Columbia River. And a fish weir is a traditional wood-like structure that allows people to fish off of a weir, but my general understanding of it without visiting the site is that it's essentially testing out selection in the ability to like select out size and species, and that it's a lot more effective at avoiding bycatch and other types of like issues and challenges. And so you're sort of seeing this return to like technologies, right? That it's a special permit that it operates under for research. It's not like an approved method of fishing by Fish and Wildlife departments or things like that, but that, there are people that are kind of looking at this of being like, maybe old technology is actually the better technology today, and looking at those types of research questions. I still think that there's a big need for indigenous-led work, and I think that there's some ongoing challenges or conflict that can exist with sort of, academia has a long history of extraction and kind of marginalization, and that's sort of a watch out that's going on right now within the general sciences, and like traditional knowledge of tribal people is sort of taking the knowledge and then not continuing to process it, which that's kind of teachings of Coyote that we talked about, right? It's like, it should be iterative. There needs to be constant engagement and involvement. It's not like you can come to tribes, they give you the information. Like I talk, like that laboratory that this place is, right? Like in order for it to be as meaningful as it can, you have to continue to have relationship and engagement. And that is where that type of work needs to go. So while I encourage and like I inspire that idea to have people, looking at indigenous teachings, like, I really want to see those people, have indigenous people be a part of that, because I think it's going to make it that much better and stronger. But we're also not replicating like colonial legacies and racist traditions of extracting things from marginalized communities, and kind of some of the dilemma that that has traditionally happened in academia. And so we just need to like be careful of that and make sure that we're not replicating it, and making sure that there's a social justice element to all this work as well that you can't overlook.
I'd like to just touch on fire. We have worked with Katie McKendrick with a Long-Tom Watershed, who recognizes the value of fire as an ecological tool, but is quick to recognize the historic and cultural use of fire. She's brought in our own fire crew to work on a demonstration project just a few weeks ago. And the goal is kind of looking at building a consortium of fire qualified folks to use fire as a tool throughout the valley. And I think that loosely ties back to some of the cultural use of fire from the past. One of the challenges with fire is that if you're a wildland firefighter, and Dave was one, so he can probably jump ahead of me if I get off track, but you're only really employed when there's wildland fire. There's a lot there. If it's not a big fire year, you're basically unemployed. And so one of the benefits of this consortium is that wildland fire folks could have a reliable fire job as ecological burns throughout the valley. And I applaud Katie and the work that she does in trying to build a consortium that can do that kind of work.
Great. Well, thank you both. You've given me a lot to think about and really changed the way I've thought about a number of these issues. So this is really all very fascinating. That's all the time we really have for today. It's after 8:30. Thank you everyone who stayed with us, who joined us tonight. Thank you so much, David and Kelly, for your time. And a huge thanks again to Dave Eckert for bringing us all together tonight. I think this series was really wonderful, and the library is so happy to have been a part of it. So thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Confederated Tribes. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. All right. Good night, everybody. Have a good evening. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.